So good morning everybody. I hope you can hear me well. If you cannot, please say me so. Okay, perfect. We already have some positive feedback. I also hope that technical conditions are good, given the conditions in which we meet, that is online. So if everything works, please let me introduce myself. My name is Massimo LEONE. I'm an Italian professor. I teach at the University of Turin in the northern part of Italy and at the University of Shanghai, where I've been honored to be a visiting professor for a number of years now. Here in Turin, I teach at the Department of Philosophy, and my specialization is Semiotics, as well as Philosophy of Communication. Today, we'll start our seminar on critical semiotics. It is a denomination that is not very usual, even in the field of semiotics. The adjective critical has been attached to other disciplines, but usually not to the name of the discipline called semiotics. You have probably heard about critical theory, but semiotics has been defined general semiotics on the one hand, or applied semiotics to the other hand. Now we have two tasks ahead. The first task is to understand what semiotics is, to reach an agreement, a common sense about what semiotics means. The second task is to define what is critical about this semiotics. What is critical semiotics? What do we talk about when we talk about critical semiotics? Well, let me start from the name of the discipline, semiotics. As you might know, since you might have already followed some courses of semiotics or even some advanced courses of semiotics, the word semiotics derives from a ancient Greek root, from an ancient Greek word. This ancient Greek word is semeion. Semeion in ancient Greek means sign. Now, let me start with a question that I usually do not ask to my students in the first years. I do not ask this question to freshmen of semiotics. I usually ask this question to advanced students of semiotics. The question is the following: why do we think that ancient Greeks should have a specific word to designate the sign? Because this is exactly what semeion means in Greek, in ancient Greek. It means sign. So when we come across a language like ancient Greek, like Chinese, like Italian, like English, and there is a word in this language, and this word corresponds to an idea, to a concept, to an entity that has a certain importance, relevance in society, then we should ask, but why does this word exist in such language? You're probably familiar with a hypothesis that was formulated a long time ago by two anthropologists and linguists who were mainly active in United States, in the Americas. The hypothesis is very known to linguists and is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. In a nutshell, according to this hypothesis, languages take shape in relation to the environment, and the importance of words in languages is a reflection of such an environment. The typical example that is always offered to students of semiotics or comparative linguistics in the first years of their formation is the word snow. As you might know, as you might have already read or studied, Eskimos, people who work, live, exist in close contact with the ice, snow and cold climates, have many words to designate different kinds of snow. Why? Well, according to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this happens because snow is an important element in the social, cultural, but also natural environment of Eskimos. So these people and their culture and their society and their language develop a number of words to designate different kinds of snow, different specificities of snow, because articulating the semantic field of snow, distinguishing between different kinds of snow, is important for these people, is important for their survival, is important for their society. Now, let's consider this hypothesis, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and let's go back to our initial question. Why is it that the ancient Greeks had a specific word to designate the sign, what in English we call a sign, S-I-G-N? This question seems banal, seems trivial, but it is actually a difficult question. Why? Because a sign is not like snow, it is not like water, it is not like fire, it is not like hands, it is not like face. It is not a word that corresponds to an object, to an entity that can be easily identified in the external reality. You see, I guess that all languages in the world have a word for face. Although many languages, including Chinese, have different words to designate the face. In English you have face, you have visage. In Italian you have more words, you have viso, you have faccia, you have sembiante, and so on and so forth. But a face is something that all human beings have an experience of. It is something that exists in reality. It is something that we perceive through our senses. It is something that is fundamental in most societies, or maybe in all societies, for the interaction among human beings. Now, what about a sign? A sign does not actually exist in reality. It is not something that we can see. It is not something that we can hear. It is not something that we can easily grasp. A sign is not like water, is not like fire, is not like the face, is not like rice. A sign is actually a concept, is an idea. Now, the question that I'm asking to myself and to yourselves is, why did ancient Greeks have a specific word to designate this idea? Why did they come up with the word semeion? And we know actually that it is not only ancient Greeks who had such a word. Ancient China also had a word for sign. Many Indo-European languages have specific words for sign, but not all languages have a specific word for sign. So we should ask ourselves, if for ancient Greeks this word existed, what was the place of this word in their language, in their culture, and in their society? Well, I'm encouraging you to go in the direction of thinking that if ancient Greeks had this word in their language, is that for ancient Greeks this word, this concept was important. Was probably not important as water, not as important as fire, not as important as space, but it was nevertheless important. Why was it important? Because for ancient Greeks and for the cultures that stemmed from the culture of ancient Greece, let's say all Western cultures, it was and it still is fundamental to think that reality is not composed of one layer only. Reality is not composed by one dimension only. Reality is not a surface. Reality has depth. For ancient Greeks, the word semeion existed and it was important because for ancient Greeks, reality had depth. Perhaps ancient Greeks were influenced also by their experience of the sea. The fact of living in close contact with the sea. But this is just a speculation. Just consider that living in close contact with the sea makes you immediately understand that there is a surface of things, there is a surface of reality, but then you can also dive into it. You can go in the depth of this reality and you can discover more and more layers to it, more and more depth to it. Now, the presence and the importance of the word semeion, sign in Greek, indicates not only that for this civilization reality had depth, reality had more layers, reality had more dimensions, but it indicates as well that for this civilization, for this culture, it was important to be able to go through a special process, a special mental process, a special cognitive process. And this special mental process, this special cognitive process, is still fundamental in many cultures, definitely in all Western cultures. But from what I know about Chinese culture, it is fundamental in Chinese culture as well. What is this process? This process is the following. When we interact with reality, when we interact with the environment, when we interact with other human beings, but also when we interact with the natural environment, with the social environment, and more when we interact right now also with machines. We have in mind this idea that reality has depth, that reality has many layers. But at the same time, we also have another idea. And this is what this process, mental process, is about. What is this idea? The idea is that we can actually use the surface of things in order to understand what hides in their depths. We can look at the surface of the sea and try to understand from the surface of the sea, from how the surface of the sea looks like, what is in the depths of the sea. You see, I'm becoming more and more interested and also perhaps a little bit expert about the face. And some of my research is devoted to the topic of a physiognomy. What is physiognomy? It's something that existed in ancient Greece, but it existed in ancient China as well. It is the idea that when we see the face of a person, this face is not only a surface. It appears as a surface to us, but this surface has actually depth behind it. There are different layers, different dimensions that hide behind and beyond the surface of the face. This is something that most of us instinctively do. Many of you, for instance, are probably seeing my face, my own face, for the first time. But you are not happy with the surface of this face. You are not limited to observing how this surface looks like. You are actually almost naturally, almost instinctively speculating, reflecting, making hypotheses, formulating ideas about what is behind this face. Is this an intelligent person? Is this a stupid person? Is this a wise person? Is this a silly person? Is this a person that I can trust? Is this a person I cannot trust? Is this a sad person? Is this a happy person? You see, all these doesn't show immediately on the surface of the face. This is something that we must retrieve, we must speculate about, we must somehow draw from the depth that is beyond that surface, beyond the surface of the face. Well, the Greek word semeion, sign, and the idea that this word is about is exactly about this process. Is the idea that reality has many layers, reality has many dimensions, that is not simply a surface, that there are different layers beyond this surface, and that we can actually use the surface of things as a sign. We can use it as something in order to know something else. We can use the surface of things as something visible in order to understand something invisible. We can use the way in which a face looks like in order to understand the personality of someone. Or, as ancient China believed, we can use the surface of a face in order to understand the future of a person, what is invisible in time, and not only what is invisible in personality. This is actually how ancient semiotics started. It started as a speculation on the invisible. It started as a speculation, a reflection, a study, a research on what was not immediately perceptible in the environment, on what should actually be understood from the surface of things. Indeed, you might probably guess what was the specific field in which semiotics first developed in ancient Greece. There is still nowadays a specific branch of medicine, what doctors study, which is called in English semiotics. Semiotics. What is semiotics? Semiotics is just an ancient word for diagnostics. What is it that doctors do when you go to see one of them for the first time? Well, what they do is exactly to go through a very complex semiotic process. They observe the surface of the body, they observe how the body looks like, what is visible in the body, in order to understand and determine what is invisible. What is invisible, for instance? A disease, an illness. You see, normally I would be there with you in Shanghai, and we would have this course face to face. And you know, of course, the reason for which we are not able to meet in person. The reason for which we cannot meet in person is that there is a very dangerous virus that circulates throughout the world. But it's not easy for a doctor to immediately understand whether a person has been already infected with this virus or not. The semiotics of this virus is quite complex. It requires a certain technique. It requires some complex examinations. But in ancient Greece, doctors could not rely on laboratories, could not rely on complicated instruments, could not prescribe blood tests, for instance. What they could do was to observe the body, smell the body, hear the body, touch the body, use their senses in order to study the surface of the body and transform it into a matrix of signs, into a series of signs, visible signs, through which one could understand something invisible beyond it. This is something that is still very important in medicine, but if you think about it, we are all doctors. We are all doctors. Not in the sense that we have all studied medicine, but in the sense that we constantly try to understand what is beyond the surface of things. What is it that is behind a person's face? What is it that hides beyond the text? Many of you, just let me give you another example, might be students of literature. Some of you might be students of cinema. But think about reading a novel, reading a classic like Tolstoy's War and Peace. and just stick to the surface of the novel. Just stick to how the novel first looks like to readers. Just consider that the novel is about a story of war and peace. Of course, this would be an extremely poor reading of that novel. This would be a superficial reading of that novel. In order to do justice to the novel, we actually must act exactly like doctors in ancient Greece. We must consider that what we find at the surface of the novel, the characters, the descriptions, the actions, are visible elements that must lead to something that is not immediately visible, that's something that hides in the depths of the novel. Now, being critical about something means, from a certain point of view, also considering that we should not stop at the surface of things. We should go in depth. We should dive into the surface in order to understand what a more complex and deeper elements hide in its depth. So, being critical means, first of all, adopting a certain point of view that has been central in ancient Greece, that has been central in many Western cultures, that has been central also in the history of China, that considers the complexity, the multi-layer nature of reality. Considers so that in order to fully grasp the environment, we should go beyond the appearances. Now, other ways of life are possible. We are not actually naturally inclined to go always toward a deep understanding of the environment. We might somehow and sometimes stop also at the surface of things. If we go toward the depth of something, it is because we have somehow received this concept, this attitude, this cultural attitude from ancient Greece. And this cultural attitude is exactly what I call an ideology, and specifically a semiotic ideology. Now, ideology is a very difficult word, is a very difficult concept. Why is it so difficult? It is difficult because it has actually been used in many different ways. You have a certain concept of ideology in the philosophers of the French Revolution, in the 18th century philosophers. You have a certain conception of ideology in Marx and Engels. And you have also a concept of ideology that belongs to contemporary anthropology and linguistics. Now, one of the main objectives of this course will also be that of going through these different ideas, these different conceptions of ideology. We should come up with a common understanding of what ideology is. Why? Because I consider this to be quite an advanced course of semiotics. So, if this was an introductory course to semiotics, I would say, okay, semiotics is the discipline that studies science. And this is how semiotics is usually defined for beginners, for freshman students. Semiotics is a discipline studied in many universities with a certain history, with a certain tradition, with certain classics, with certain scholars. And the main objective is to study science, to study systems of science, to study signification, communication. But I'm not actually satisfied with this definition, especially in the framework of an advanced graduate seminar. Because what is even more important is to ask ourselves a meta question. So why is it that semiotics exists? Or you might ask the same question about other very common disciplines. You see, you might ask the same question about history. So if you go to an introductory course of history, the professor will probably say, okay, we'll start from prehistory, then ancient history, then the Middle Ages, then early modern, then contemporary history, and we'll talk about what happened in Italy, in China, in the United States, revolutions, wars, politics, and so on and so forth. But then you can also have a more complex understanding. You can have a more complex approach and ask, in the case of history too, a meta question. And the meta question is, why is history important? Why is it important to human beings to remember certain things and to remember them in a chronological order? Why is it that many centuries ago in China, in ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt, some people became specialists at recording things that had happened throughout time? So we're not asking simple questions here. We are not simply asking what happened in history. We are asking the question, why does it matter to us, to human beings, to remember what happened in history? We are not asking the simple question, what is the sign? What is it that something means? We are asking the more complex question, why is it that in the first instance, the concept of sign actually matters to us? Well, there are many ways of answering this question. One way to answer it is to formulate the hypothesis that thinking about reality through science actually gives an advantage to human beings. It is advantageous to human beings to think about reality in terms of science. It is an advantage for human beings to conceive of reality as something that doesn't simply have a surface but different layers. Let's go back to our simple example. We might stick to the surface of a face and not speculate about what is beyond that face, but at the same time it gives us certainly an advantage to try to understand what is hidden beyond the surface of things. For instance, it gives us certainly an advantage to understand what is the personality of a human being. What is the personality, for instance, of someone we must deal with? The personality of someone we are having business with, for instance. if we can trust this person, if we cannot trust this person. So people who are more apt, who are more effective at understanding the science of reality, they probably have a specific ability to adapt to the environment. This is one way to answer the question. There is a certain place for semiotics even in the evolution of the human species. So members of the human species that were more apt, that were more proficient at deciphering the science of the environment, were probably endowed with a special gift. They could read the environment much better. And this is something that we experience also in everyday life. There are people who are able to read the environment in a very complex way. In English, especially in the US, people say of these particular human beings that they have long antennae. Long antennae, as if they were insects able to detect what is in the environment in a more proficient way than the average. Usually leaders in society, political leaders for instance, are endowed or should be endowed with this ability of seeing not only what appears, not only the surface of things, but also what lies beyond and behind, what is in the depth of this reality. At the same time, we should also focus on the fact that this ability to detect what is hidden in the depth of reality, it is something that human beings do spontaneously, but it's also something that has evolved into a specific knowledge. And this specific knowledge is the knowledge that goes under the very broad name of interpretation. Interpretation. What is it that we do when we go beyond the surface of a text, of a movie? What is it that we do when we try to understand the ideology of an advertisement? What is it that we do when we see the facade of a building, and what we do is not just stick at the facade, admiring its shape, admiring its lines, but go beyond it and try to understand what this facade means. What is it that the architect, but also what is it that a certain community of people tries to express, tries to communicate, tries to signify through that facade. All this is interpretation. Can we live without interpretation? Can we live even one single day without interpretation? Do we actually live one day, one single day of our life without interpretation? This is probably something that we never do. Since the moment we are born, we are actually constantly, unceasingly interpreting reality. Even beyond our imagination. For instance, even before our senses are completely developed, we start interpreting reality. Even when we are newborn human beings and our eyes do not work still properly, our sight is still developing, our hearing is still developing, the images, visual images that we receive from reality are still blurred. Even in those first days, even in those first weeks, even in those first months of our life, we are already interpreting the still imperfect stimuli that we receive from reality through our still shaping senses. So interpretation is something that actually goes on throughout our entire life. It starts when we are born, and it will continue with us until we'll die, until the moment of our death. Every day, every minute of our life will be a moment of interpretation. Now, if you think about this continuous presence of interpretation throughout our existence, throughout our life, you might think that this is very tiresome, this is very fatiguing, this is very demanding. How can we live and interpret reality all the time since the moment we are born until the moment we die? How is it that we don't get exhausted with it? Well, of course, sometimes we do. Sometimes we do get exhausted with interpretation. I've been traveling extensively throughout my life, and especially I've been traveled a lot when I was a student. I've studied in many European countries, but also in United States. Then I've traveled also as a professor, and there is a beautiful but also tremendous moment that happens in the life of a traveler, and it is the moment when, after taking a plane or a train or a bus or whatever, you end up in a country that you do not know, surrounded by a culture that you do not know, surrounded by a language that you do not speak. And those first moments, those first days, those first weeks that you are immersed in that reality are moments, days and weeks of intense interpretation. You are struggling with all your cognitive capacities to decode a new environment, to decode a new culture, to decode a new language. In a way, traveling to an unknown country, traveling to an unknown civilization, immersing oneself into an unknown language is a little bit like going back to the first days, to the first weeks, to the first months of one's life, when everything is new, everything is unknown, everything is to be decoded, especially if the culture, the language we are immersing ourselves in is particularly far from our knowledge, from our experience. These first moments are elating, are exciting, are full of enthusiasm, but at the same time they are a tremendous toll. They are very heavy on our cognitive abilities. We can actually get exhausted from interpretation. We need from time to time to hide from this reality, to hide from this language, to hide from this culture, because the stimuli that we receive are too many. So, yes, interpretation is always with us. Interpretation is a constant present in the life of a human being. It cannot be avoided. At the same time, interpretation is something that can be exhausting. It's something that in certain conditions can be extremely difficult. In complex environments, in environments that we do not know, interpretation is actually very, very painstaking. And this is something that ancient Greeks must have somehow understood. They understood that in order to go through interpretation in critical moments, one needs not only the instinct of interpretation, one needs also a technique. In order to survive interpretation, we need a technique. And this is another important element that is beyond the word semeion. It is behind the very first conception of semiotics. Semiotics is a discipline that essentially starts from the idea that reality is complex, that reality has depth, that the surface of reality can be used in order to access this invisible depth, but at the same time it also stems from the idea that this passage from the surface to the depth is something that can be actually transformed into a technique. It is not something that is demanded to a natural individual effort. We are interpreting beings, we are doomed to interpret, but semiotics, as it was conceived by ancient Greeks, was a technique to guide this interpretation, especially in difficult moments. So this is the first definition that I'll give you of critical semiotics. Critical semiotics is the technique of interpreting a complex reality, especially in difficult times. And with this first definition, we'll have our first 10 minutes break. Thank you for your attention, and we'll resume exactly in 10 minutes. Hello everybody, and welcome back. Of course, it is a pleasure for me to receive your comments and questions at any time, but we will also have a specific session for discussion and question at the end of our lesson of today. But please feel free to ask questions directly through the chat or through our teaching assistant, Dr. Nisi Chang, whom I thank very much, at any moment. So, after briefly, abstractedly, and theoretically introduce the very general framework of the course, what we generally need to approach the questions, the big questions of critical semiotics, let me now briefly summarize and then offer an example. So we have started with the very traditional etymological definition of semiotics. We have pointed out that it derives from the word and concept of sign, semeion, in ancient Greece. We have wondered why such word and such concept should be so central in the culture of ancient Greece and in those cultures that have stemmed from it, basically all Western cultures. And we have also underlined that if this word and this concept existed and were so prominent, it was because of a certain understanding of reality, that conceives of it as endowed with a surface, but also with depth and with the possibility of systematically know this invisible depth by studying the visible surface. We have also introduced the idea that basically the process that is constantly needed to human beings in order to go from the surface to depth of things is interpretation. And we have proposed that semiotics is actually a technique for interpretation. It is a systematic method for interpretation. But we have also suggested that semiotics is not a natural technique, but a technique that is the product of a certain ideology. And throughout our seminar, we are going to discuss more and more about the concept, the idea of ideology, and the way in which it can be used to reframe semiotics in a critical way. Now, let me show you a very simple example. I hope you can see my screen. I'm sharing one of the pages of the website of my currently most important research project, which is called Facets, Face Aesthetics in Contemporary E-Technological Societies. It is a 5-year research project financed by the European Union that basically studies the face. As I told you before, the face is my main object of investigation at the moment, not only in terms of applied semiotics, but also in terms of let's say theoretical thinking and rethinking about semiotics. Now, this project has a website, and this website gathers many different studies concerning the face, and this is one of them. Now, you can read the title of this post that appears once again on the website of the research project. The post reads, "Were Roman emperors blonde? A controversial experiment with GAN." I don't know if you are familiar with artificial intelligence, with neural networks, with the so-called deep learning. Basically, artificial intelligence is evolving very fast, evolving in surprising ways, and it is evolving especially in relation to the object that is at the center of this research project, the face. More and more artificial intelligence is used in order to deal with the human face. You're probably familiar with facial face recognition, which is very prominent in China, but if you have Apple iPad or MacBook or iPhone of new generation, you're probably familiar with Face ID. So it's artificial intelligence applied to the recognition of human faces. But there are many more applications of artificial intelligence to faces. Now, there is a specific a specific technology in artificial intelligence, which is called GAN, G-A-N. GAN stands for Generative Adversarial Networks. You're probably familiar with neural networks. You probably know what neural networks are. Basically, during the development of artificial intelligence, the idea was to come up to construct machines that would somehow simulate the functioning of the brain. And this is what a neural network is a machine which has a certain number of nodes, and these nodes are linked with each other and process information together, and their way of processing information simulates or tries to simulate the way in which the human being and the human brain in particular processes, treats information. Now, since 2017, 2018, a new kind of neural networks have been engineered. These neural networks are called generative adversarial network. Why are they called adversarial? They are called adversarial because it is not actually one neural network working on its own, but more neural networks competing with each other, as if they were trying to outdo each other. So the idea is, okay, we have the human brain. We want to simulate the way in which the human brain works through a machine. we want to develop artificial intelligence, but we realize that brains, human brains, do not actually work in isolation. They work in society. They work through actually competing with each other. This is how human brains also develop. We want to constantly outsmart other people. So, generative adversarial networks were developed by applying this concept of biological evolution and cultural evolution to neural networks. So there is not one machine simulating the human brain. There are several machines competing with each other, trying to outsmart each other, simulating the human brain about some specific tasks. Now, there is a visual artist from the Netherlands. His name is Daniel Voshaert. He has applied this new technology. He has applied generative adversarial networks, also called GAN, GANs, to a very peculiar, to a very particular task. This task was the task of reconstructing the face of Roman emperors, to try to come up with realistic depictions, realistic representations of how Roman emperors would look like. So let's go to the website of this visual artist. This visual artist uses this particular technique, generative adversarial networks, in order to reconstruct the face of Roman emperors. It is called the Roman Emperor Project. So as you can read, using the neural net tool ArtBreeder, Photoshop and historical references, I have created photoreal portraits of Roman emperors. For this project, I have transformed or restored cracks, noses, ears, etc. almost 1,000 images of busts to make the 54 emperors of the Principate, 27 BC to 285 AD. So these are, on the left, the way in which this technique, this artificial intelligence, starting from all these thousands depictions of emperors in history, sculptures, but also some portraits, effigies on coins and so on and so forth, have reconstructed realistic photoreal representations of this emperor. So this is on the right, how the Emperor Augustus, Roman Emperor Augustus, would have looked like, and this is how the Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax would have looked like. And this is an entire dynasty that has been reconstructed through this technique. So this is how, according to artificial intelligence applied to thousands of ancient representations of these faces, would look like. Now, you might ask at this stage, so what is it that this experiment in visual arts has to do with semiotics? What is it that it has to do with critical semiotics? What is it that has to do with ideology? What is the ideology of this visual experiment? What is the ideology that we can somehow detect in this visual experiment? So if you are a naive reader, if you are someone who doesn't know semiotics, doesn't know critical theory, someone who just read the news, someone who just reads the newspapers online, for instance, you come across this news, oh, this visual artist reconstructs the faces of Roman emperors, and you come across this a representation, and you are basically amazed by the fact that, oh wow, technology actually allows us to see how Roman emperors would look like in the past. We can see them as if they were human beings in front of us. So if you are distractedly looking at this experiment transmits to you, gives to you what a famous semiotician called Roland Barthes would call a reality effect. So technology and the reference to this advanced technology, to artificial intelligence, gives you the idea that, okay, wow, finally we can see how they would look like. Artificial intelligence is allowing me to move back to the past and see the faces of these Roman emperors. But this, again, would be a very simplistic reception of this experiment. This would be tantamount, would mean staying at the surface of things. What is the problem here? What is that we should actually, as critical thinkers, as critical semioticians, as critical theoreticians, encourage people to detect? What is it that people do not normally see here? Well, first of all, you might have realized that, well, these portraits, these representations are presented as the real faces of Roman emperors, but there is actually something that is hidden, that is not clearly stated. These faces have been reconstructed through artificial intelligence. This is true, but the sources of artificial intelligence are not actually artificial, they are human. So artificial intelligence is impartial, is an algorithm, it is a machine, but it is trained, it is fed with images, sculptures, portraits, and so on and so forth, that have been created by human beings, not by machines. So you see where the first ideological element is. Whenever in an article like this, in an experiment like this one, we are told that, oh, artificial intelligence reveals to us the real faces of Roman emperors, we are led to believe that this reconstruction is impartial, that this reconstruction has been carried on by machines, by artificial intelligence. This is true, but what is not said to us, what is actually hidden, what is concealed, is that beyond and behind artificial intelligence, there is human intelligence. Artificial intelligence reconstructed these Roman emperors' faces, but on the basis of thousands of human-made representations. So I want to encourage you to consider this example, but to also take advantage from this example in order to understand, grasp one of the most common ideological features of our times and our cultures. Every time that we are told that something is true because it is the product of a machine, that something is true because it is the product of big data, big numbers, the product of a large amount of data, well, we should be probably suspicious. You see, in this case, this artist tells us, okay, there are thousands of images of Roman emperors that I've used. These images have been scanned by a machine, so the result is actually believable, is realistic. But what we are not told is that nevertheless, these thousands images are a selection of available images, and that the machine works through a specific human-made algorithm in order to carry on this reconstruction. So, some art historians have actually looked at this experiment and have become a little bit suspicious. For instance, a media expert called David Kochi wrote an article that I'm sharing with you now called "Were Roman Emperors Blondie?" Why? Because if you look at the project of this visual artist, you realize that actually many of the Roman emperors are blonde. Augustus was blonde, Tiberius was blonde, Claudius was blonde, Lucius Verus was blonde. So many of these emperors, especially the most famous ones, are actually reconstructed by artificial intelligence as being blonde. Now, I don't know if you've ever traveled to Italy, but there are not too many blonde people in Italy. There are not too many people in Italy that look like this image of Augustus. There are not too many people in Italy that look like this image of Tiberius. Not too many people that look like this image of Otho. This Augustus doesn't actually look Italian. How does it look like? What nationality does it look like? Well, in this article, this art historian who has critically deconstruct this experiment with artificial intelligence has found out why this artificial intelligence has reconstructed human emperors as blonde. What is the reason? The reason is that in reconstructing these faces, in training artificial intelligence, this visual artist has used many sources, but has used also sources from 1930s Germany. So books of art history with images of emperors, of Roman emperors, that were actually published in 1930s Germany. And you know what was happening in 1930s Germany? There was an ideology called Nazism. There was an ideology that was inspired by Italian fascism that believed that Germany should be the Third Reich. It should be a reconstitution of the glorious Roman Empire. And there were so many scholars in classics who would work on this ideological project. Even Adolf Hitler himself would believe that Roman emperors in the past were blonde. So sources from that epoch, art history books from 1930s Germany, actually represent Roman emperors as blonde. But not because they were blonde, but because they wanted to present them as the origin, as the natural link in history with the new empire that Nazi Germany wanted to reconstruct. That was deeply ideological, of course. It was Nazi ideology, believing that Roman emperors were blonde, that they were Aryan, that they were the sources of the new Nazi empire. But when artificial intelligence is trained with these sources,
somehow it absorbs this ideology. It absorbs this ideology, and in a way it makes it even more powerful because it hides it in the mechanisms, in the processes, in the algorithms of artificial intelligence. So this Dutch visual artist is not probably Nazi. Is probably just someone who doesn't know about history, about ideologies in history, and it has taken all representations of Roman emperors in time without any criterion for selecting them, and has fed artificial intelligence with all these representations. But artificial intelligence that has been fed with these materials has inherited the ideologies of these materials, including the Nazi ideology that in the 1930s would depict Roman emperors as a blonde. And so that's why automatically through generative adversarial networks these Roman emperors are actually depicted as blonde. You see, we have different ideologies here. We have the first ideology, which is the Nazi ideology that depicts Roman emperors as blonde in order to make them the ideological origin of the imperialistic project of Nazi Germany. But you also have a contemporary present-day ideology that is even more difficult for us to detect. Why? Why is it more difficult? Because we live surrounded by it. You see, for people who would live in 1930s Germany, unfortunately, for many of them, for most of them, it was impossible to see that ideology. It was impossible to see that that ideology was nefarious for the history of humanity, because they were surrounded by it. It was a sort of a natural environment. Now, after many years, after almost 1 century, we can see that that depiction of Roman emperors in 1930s Germany was actually a pure product of ideology, because we have a historical distance from it. We are far from it in time, and we can judge it also on the basis of knowledge of what happened afterwards. But we cannot detect in the same way the ideology of artificial intelligence, because it's a present-day ideology. It surrounds us. It is almost natural. It is presented as a matter of fact to us. So whenever a journalist writes an article saying, okay, artificial intelligence was used to reconstruct the faces of Roman emperors, we don't think, oh, okay, but what are the sources? What are the sources that were used? How were they selected? How were they given to the machine? What is the algorithm that the machine uses in order to come up with these representations? Now, what we think, if we don't reflect, is, okay, that's true. This is how they look like. And we don't realize that actually artificial intelligence is reproducing a Nazi prejudice about how Roman emperors would look like. So this is just an example to let you understand that the purpose of critical semiotics is not actually that of being critical about issues in society and reality that are already under the eyes of everyone and that already perceived by everyone and without too much need for interpretation. The most urgent task of critical semiotics is to understand where ideology is at work unperceived, where it is present without actually being visible, where it affects the human judgment without actually being acknowledged as such. But there is also a more general understanding of a ideology that we should take into account. Because as I already mentioned to you, the state of the art, the bibliography about the concept of ideology is very vast and is very complex. So it is important to summarize at least the extant knowledge about this topic, and above all elaborate on a very important passage, the passage from the concept of ideology in philosophy to the concept of ideology in anthropology. What is the difference? Well, when we talk about the ideology of artificial intelligence or the ideology of Nazi Germany, we are talking about a set of ideas that influence the judgment and the behavior of people belonging to a certain community, to a certain society. In this acceptance, ideology is usually meant in negative terms. When we say that a certain novel, a certain movie, a certain advertisement is ideological, according to this definition, we are saying that this novel, this movie, this advertisement is conveying a certain set of ideas. It is deeply influenced by a certain set of ideas without actually acknowledging them. So, representations of Roman emperors in 1930s Germany were ideological because they were actually influenced by a specific ideology, which was the ideology of the race, the racist ideology of a Nazi Germany. So when we are saying that those representations were ideological, we are saying that they were the product of a certain set of ideas, and that this set of ideas were instrumental, had a deep impact in the shaping of these representations. We are also saying something else. We are actually usually passing judgment on the ideology itself. So, according to this traditional philosophical acceptance, when we are saying that representations of Roman emperors in Nazi Germany were ideological, we are saying that the set of ideas that influenced the shaping of this representation was a bad set of ideas. We are actually giving implicitly a negative judgment to this set of ideas. We are saying that these ideas were wrong, were bad, that they were part of an ideology. Now, this is not the only acceptance of the word ideology. This is how the word ideology is commonly used, and this is how the word ideology is used mainly in the philosophical tradition, in the tradition of a cultural philosophy and political philosophy. There is another tradition, there is another understanding of the word ideology. It is the way in which anthropology has used, has understood the concept of ideology. It is a very different way. So let me elaborate on that, because it is very important. Let me elaborate on this distinction, this difference between the traditional philosophical way of understanding ideology, which I've just explained, set of ideas, mostly negative set of ideas influencing the behavior and judgment and artifacts of certain community, and the anthropological understanding of ideology. Now, the theory and analysis of ideologies in anthropology has been carried on specifically in a particular branch of anthropology called linguistic anthropology. What is linguistic anthropology? Well, as you might guess, it's a branch of anthropology that specifically deals with the role and place of language in human societies. It deals with the different ways in which human cultures deal with language, and specifically with verbal language. So, linguistic anthropology is not linguistics. Linguistics is a study of the human language, a systematic study of human language, and mostly linguistics, the tradition of cognitive linguistics, for instance, Chomsky's linguistics in the United States, but also the tradition of structural linguistics in Europe, starting from Ferdinand de Saussure on. They're focused especially on commonality, on universality, on similarities. They have tried to understand what are the universal elements in the in the functioning of human language. Now, the approach of linguistic anthropology is different. It doesn't primarily focus on universality, on similarity, on universals. It focuses on variety. It focuses on differences. It focuses on peculiarities. So it tries to understand whether different human cultures have a different understanding of verbal language, have a different approach to verbal language, have a different use of verbal language within their communities. So we know that as human beings, we all share language. Language is a very important feature of the species. At the same time, linguistic anthropology focuses on the fact that this universal human faculty that is characteristic of the human species is inflected, is modified in contact with specific cultures. And it is exactly within this methodological theoretical framework, it is exactly within this theoretical setting that linguistic anthropology started to develop the idea of language ideology or linguistic ideology. Indeed, the theory and analysis of language ideologies has been primarily developed at the crossroad of anthropology and linguistics by those scholars and ethnologists keen on understanding the role of language in human communities, yet, as I said to you, concentrating not on universals, as classical generative linguistics characteristically does, but on local peculiarities inflecting the common human cognitive faculty of language. Ideologies have also become an independent object of inquiry in semiotics. For instance, by a Marxist Italian semiotician called Ferruccio Rossilandi, who was active in Italy but also in other countries in the 1970s, and it's actually quite famous in China. It has been translated also into Chinese. Nevertheless, this specific tradition within semiotics, so the works of Ferruccio Rossilandi, are tributary, refer to the traditional political acceptance of ideology, which could be defined as hegemonic system of biases, something that somehow connects also with the theory of cultural hegemony formulated by the other important Italian scholar and founder of the Italian Communist Party, Antonio Gramsci. So this is again a more traditional philosophical, political understanding of ideology, but on the contrary, anthropology as mostly, and especially linguistic anthropology, as mostly focused on ideology, has a concept, a more neutral concept. So in anthropology, an ideology could be defined as a meta pattern of meaning. What is a meta pattern on meaning? So you probably have probably already realized that semiotics is the discipline that studies signification, communication. It is the discipline that cultivates interpretation as a technique, as a systematic effort. And so semiotics is interested in the patterns of meaning in reality, the patterns of meaning. Now, when we say that ideologies for anthropology are meta patterns of meaning, we are saying that there is not only interpretation, there is also somehow a background of interpretation, something that leads us to interpret in a certain way, and something that leads us also to give importance to the concept of interpretation. Now, you remember what I said in the beginning of this first lesson. Greeks developed semiotics, but at the same time this development happened because there was already a certain semiotic ideology. There was a meta pattern of meaning according to which it is important to go beyond the surface of reality. So you see, we are not talking about how people interpret reality, but we are talking about why is it important for people to interpret reality, why people have a certain ideology that pushes them to believe that they should go beyond the surface of things. So attention to ideologies has been given in semiotics by famous scholars, but these famous scholars, I'm talking about Umberto Eco, for instance, in the 1970s, or Roland Barthes in his studies on contemporary myths, would mostly work on ideology in the political sense of the term, as a sort of a political mindset. On the contrary, what I would like to explore together with you through this course is exactly the linguistic anthropological definition of ideology, which is a definition first initiated by the so-called Chicago School of Linguistic Anthropology. So the School of Linguistic Anthropology that developed especially at the University of Chicago in the United States. So according to this specific anthropological a definition of ideology, what is important is not to denounce the political mindsets that are behind a certain behavior, but to uncover the invisible patterns of meaning making in social life. So this is a fundamental difference. You see, for the traditional understanding of ideology, let's say the political, philosophical understanding of ideology, ideology is always something bad. It is always something that is reproached to someone. People get accused of being ideological. But on the contrary, for the anthropological understanding of ideology, we must accept something that in the beginning is very hard to conceive, and this is that we are actually all ideological. We all have an ideology. Ideology is part of our culture, is part of our language, is part of the way in which we use language, is part of the way in which we use language in order to understand language. So, for anthropology, ideology is not something bad to be eliminated. It is something that is consubstantial in the way in which language works in societies. And it is now the moment for another short 10 minutes break, after which we are gonna resume with our course. So we're gonna have another 10 minutes break, and in exactly 10 minutes we're gonna continue our lesson. Thank you. So I hope you are back to the online class, and let me start this third part of the class of today with another example which is also taken from the website of my research project about the meaning of the face in present-day societies. Now, this is an article that I've recently found in the Spanish press, but you could find similar articles in many newspapers and online magazines around the world. And it is quite peculiar because it focuses on a series of cultural artifacts that are of a primary importance as regards the study of the meaning of the face in present-day societies. You see, they're all famous statues. This is the statue of the girl in front of the stock exchange of New York. These are the female statues that are in front of the Tour Eiffel in the Trocadero Square in Paris. This is a replica of the famous Venus of Milo in a garden of Frankfurt. These are the famous statues of the monument of the flags in a park in the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil. This is, of course, the very famous Cristo Redentor, the Redeemer, Christ the Savior, the gigantic statue that towers over Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And this again is a famous statue which is found in Guadalajara in Mexico. This again, another one, statue of the musician, famous Argentinian musician Astor Piazzolla, author and composer of many tangos in the Casino Central area in Buenos Aires in Argentina. This is a statue of a famous character in Iraqi history to be found in Suleimaniak in Iraq, 2020. This is of course a statue of the Queen Victoria in Manchester in the United Kingdom. The statue of the famous Bobby Greyfriars in Edinburgh, which is a statue of a very landmark statue in the Scottish city. And this is a statue of the Electric Lady Studio guitar dedicated to Jimi Hendrix, to be found in an avenue of Seattle. This is also a statue of Buddha in Bangkok, in Thailand. So, of course, you've realized all these statues have something in common, and this something in common is that masks have been put on the representation of the face. Medical face masks, which are probably the most famous, the most prominent, the most visible object of the present-day visual culture. Now, these masks are there not out of a joke. It's not a joke. They are not. They have not been put on the faces of these statues, on the faces of the sculptures, to joke about the statues, their meaning, or to joke about the pandemic, or to joke about the medical face masks. There are other reasons beyond a certain irony. The reason behind this presence of face masks on statues is that these face masks have actually been put there by authorities. The government, the state, the city hall officially put face masks on these famous statues. So this immediately turns these face masks and they have been put on the faces of statues into a message, into something that we should decode, that we should interpret, but also into something that conveys a certain knowledge about the ideology that is behind these experiments, these visual experiments. So, what has pushed authorities in New York, authorities in France, authorities in Germany, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Argentina, in Iraq, in England, in United States and Thailand to put masks on statues? Well, of course, these medical face masks have been put on the faces of statues because these statues are somehow iconic. They are what is usually called a landmark. What is a landmark? A landmark is something in a society that you actually see as a central prominent place in a certain urban landscape. So the statues are very famous. The statues are extremely prominent in the visual landscape of the city. These statues are very well known. They are known for the community, but in some cases they are known also beyond the community. They are world famous. They are famous for tourists and visitors. So why did authorities, city halls, governments, institutions need to put face masks on statues? Of course, not in order to protect statues, not in order to protect sculptures. This is not exactly what this experiment is about. On the contrary, these statues were given a mask, a face mask, because there was the need to turn them into a visual statement, to turn them into an example, to turn them into something that all citizens, part of a community, could easily see and have an interpretation about. So what is the message of this masked status? What is the message according to you? What do you think this message is, this status with face masks on would convey? What is it that authorities, institutions are trying to communicate? Is it something that you could see also in China, on Chinese status, for instance? I don't know. I haven't seen any Chinese examples. I haven't seen any Japanese examples. I've seen mostly examples from Europe, from the United States. I've seen examples from Latin America. You see, this is interesting also because it is a moment in which the world is being hit by this tragic pandemic. It has been affected by the COVID-19 disease and the spreading of this new SARS virus. But at the same time, something else is happening in the world. It is also a period in which in many cities in the world, in many communities in the world, a political movement called Black Lives Matter is gaining momentum. You probably know the story. It started from a very controversial intervention of the US police and the killing of a African-American citizen in the United States, and then it spread everywhere in the world with some very spectacular initiatives with people in UK, in the US and other places in the world pulling down statues of characters who would be somehow guilty of a neo-colonial or racist attitudes or behaviors during their life. So it is a moment in which, on the one hand, the virus is spreading. It is a biological virus, but it is also a moment in which a new set of ideas is spreading. It is a sort of a cultural virus. It's the idea that we should reform our representation of the past. We should cancel those representations of the past, especially those monumental representations of the past, those monuments that are a legacy of an ideology that we now currently oppose, the racist ideology, the colonial ideology, and so on and so forth. So, on the one hand, the virus is spreading. On the other hand, statues are becoming again a center of attention. So, it was a perfect situation in order to transform statues into the support for a message. And this message is very simple. This message is: even statues wear masks. Even famous statues wear masks. We see statues even on the sculptured faces of statues around the cities, the most beloved statues, the statues that we all know. Now, there is something paradoxical about this example, about this statement, because of course statues do not need masks. They do not actually get affected by virus, of course. So the statement is, if even statues wear masks, just consider that yourself too should wear your mask all the time when you are in a public space, when you are in open air. Now, what is ideological about it? What is the ideology behind this statement? Why is this statement necessary? Why is it necessary to put masks on the faces of statues in order to convey to the population the message that actually it is strongly recommended that people wear masks in public? Well, probably you have realized already the direction toward which I'm going. This message is needed because the ideology of the face that is very prominent in the West, that is prominent in the US, that is prominent in Europe, is different from the ideology of the face that is prominent in China, in Japan, in Korea, in most Far East Asia. So, since the beginning of the pandemic, the ways in which states, communities reacted to the spreading of the virus was very different depending exactly on the specific culture of the face that was predominant in a certain society. Why we predominantly see these statues in the West, these masked statues in the United States or in Europe or in Latin America? Because there is a strong opposition for people, even during the pandemic, even after the spreading of the virus, to wear masks, to wear medical face masks. Many people are actually opposed to it, even now that the virus is everywhere, even now that so many thousands of people have actually died in Italy out of this disease. Even now, some people are even demonstrating in streets or in squares against the compulsory wearing of the medical face masks. Why is it so? Why is it so difficult for Italian citizens, for Spanish citizens, for French citizens, for US citizens to adopt this quite simple behavior, to get used and familiarized with this very simple device, which is a medical face mask? Well, a first reading could be, well, just because they are ignorant, or because they don't know about the virus, or because they are not aware of the danger, or they are not well educated. But there are actually even very well educated people, even university professors, who manifest their opinion against the obligatory wearing of the face mask. This is because the using of the face mask in the West, in Europe, Italy and other countries, on the one hand, and China and other Far East Asian countries, on the other hand, is very difficult to understand without considering how this object, the face mask, is not only an object, but it is the symbol, the embodiment of a cultural attitude, of an ideological attitude. So what is the face mask in China, and what is the face mask in Italy? You know, I've written several articles recently about it, but let me use it as a further example in order to give you another idea of what ideology is. In the traditional sense of the term, the sense of political ideology, in the sense of a set of ideas that influence the behavior of a people in a society. Basically, in Far East Asia, face masks were used in order to protect oneself from the virus that could be present in society, in a community, but it was immediately conceived also as a device in order to protect the community from oneself. So in China, in Japan, in Korea, the face mask is used in order to, of course, protect oneself from the possible presence of virus in public environment or in social relations, but also as a sign of being a good citizen, a good member of the community, someone who abides by the law, and even more abstractly, someone who abides by the moral terms of a society. So in order to be a good member of the society, a good member of the community, I should wear a mask, because a mask is not only to protect myself from others, it is also to protect others from myself. On the contrary, if you go back on these representations, and let me share again the screen, you see, it is somehow necessary to turn the mask into a symbolical object that is put on non-living faces, on symbolical faces, on faces that belong to iconic status, famous status, because it is important to convey a message which must be strong, which must be empowered, which must be endowed with this extra rhetorical skill, exactly because this message goes against the current ideology. The current ideology of the face and the face mask in the West, in Europe, in Italy, is not, okay, I should wear the mask in order to protect the community. The idea is I should wear the mask because I want to protect myself, or to the most, because I want to protect my family. So this is why China is actually reacting so effectively and is also dealing so effectively with the virus. And the virus was, of course, a tremendous problem in the beginning of its diffusion in China, but China was also the first country that controlled the pandemic, that took control of the situation much earlier than Italy or France, or not to speak of United States or Brazil. But this is exactly because the virus was naturally conceived not as an individual problem, but as a community problem, as something that affects a community and not as something that affects individuals. And that's why, in response to it, it is necessary not to adopt an individualistic ideology. It is important to develop and adopt a community ideology, an ideology that puts the community before the individual and not the individual before the community. The community is more important than myself. Therefore, I wear a mask all the time, even if it bothers me, because I want to protect both myself and, above all, the community in which I live. The ideology of the West, the ideology by which the virus and the pandemic has been received and has been also countered, was completely different. The idea was, I want to protect myself, I want to protect myself as an individual, but if I'm asked to do something in order to protect the community, and this something bothers me as an individual, because I must cover my face, because I must hide my individuality, because my face is not going to be singular anymore, it's not going to be easily recognizable anymore, because it's going to be an obstacle in my daily activities, then I'm not going to do it. And unfortunately, still nowadays, there are so many people in Western cultures and Western societies that have this individualistic attitude. So I don't care if my behavior is actually dangerous for the others, for the community, since the face mask bothers me when I go out, when I go to a restaurant, when I go to school, etc., etc. I'm not going to wear it. And sometimes I'm not going to wear it even if it's compulsory, you see? So this is something that it is something that affects the representation of the face, the way in which the meaning of the face circulates in a society, but affects also some very important issues like the way in which a society deals with diseases. So again, this is another example of what an ideology is about, but it is once more a traditional political understanding of ideology as a set of ideas that unconsciously, unintentionally influences the behavior of an individual in a certain community. The way in which, on the contrary, the concept of ideology has been studied by the Chicago School of Linguistic Anthropology is likely different. It is more relativistic. So it is starting from the fact that basically anyone in dealing with language has a certain ideology. There is a certain ideology every time that we speak, every time that we use human language as an instrument. We are using it according to an ideology of which we are not completely aware. Let me give you a very simple example. You see, if I were giving this class to Italian students, to students at the University of Turin, for instance, probably there would be many questions, many objections, many comments. Many people would not agree. Many people would raise their hands and say, okay, professor, but I'm not completely in line with your teaching. And this is very common. It is very common to receive questions from Italian students, and it's actually sometimes very hard to stop questions from Italian students because they're continuously asking questions. In other societies, in other cultures, students do not actually ask so many questions. But it is not because they're not curious, or they're not intelligent, or they're not smart. On the contrary, it is that students also use language and decide whether to ask or not to ask questions depending on the linguistic ideology that they have in mind. And sometimes this linguistic ideology, let's say this set of implicit ideas about the role of language in society, is not conscious, is something that has an impact but remains mostly hidden in the unawareness of people. So in this case, for instance, what is the difference in terms of linguistic ideologies? In the linguistic ideology, in the language ideology that is typical of many Western societies, including the Italian one, the contemporary Italian one, it is very important that students use language, verbal language, in order to manifest themselves, in order to show themselves, and sometimes even to show up, so to show themselves a little bit more as individuals. That's why it is very recommended that they ask questions. That is why they implicitly and spontaneously ask many questions. And if you move from European societies, European communities, to the US, this is even more striking. So sometimes I've been teaching in United States, University of Berkeley, for instance, and in some of these universities, the teacher speaks very little because most of the class is actually a discussion that is made up by students with their questions, with their comments, with their opinions. That is why, that is because in this particular setting, the prevailing language ideology is a language ideology that pushes even more students to express themselves as individuals, as individualities in the class. On the contrary, if you move to other cultural settings, if you move to other cultures, and as a consequence also if you move to a different language ideologies, then the role that language has in the society changes, and it changes also in relation to questions. So in certain cultures, even in Far East Asia for instance, asking a question means standing out as an individual in relation to the community. So it is something that is probably good and encouraged in Western terms, but it is to be seen as a manifestation of arrogance in traditional, let's say, Eastern terms. So whereas according to the Western language ideology, asking a question is a praiseworthy manifestation of one's subjectivity, on the other hand, in other cultural settings and according to the language ideology of other communities, asking a question means standing out as an individual to the detriment of the community, means showing off, means also revealing the fact that one doesn't know. So in some circumstances the word of the teacher is much more important than the word of the students. The teacher should talk all the time and students should listen all the time. Because in these societies, which are more traditional, of course, this is how Italian society traditionally also was, there is a certain power attached to the role of the teacher. The teacher is the one who has knowledge, the teacher who has, is the one who has culture, and as a consequence there is a strong asymmetry, there is a strong imbalance in the, let's say, handling of the word. You see, this is just an example to let you know that depending on the different language ideologies, what changes is not only what people say, because this is banal, this is trivial. We know that in different societies people say different things. But language ideology is not about the content, the what is said. Language ideologies is about the how things are said. So the relation with language, with the functions of language, with how, for instance, language is considered as a scarce resource that must be distributed according to a certain ideology, to a certain idea of hegemony. This is what mainly the US linguistic and semiotic anthropology has underlined. So I'm talking about scholars like Alessandro Duranti at University of Los Angeles, Webb Keane at University of Michigan, Richard Parmentier at the Brandeis University, or Michael Silverstein, who has just passed away, unfortunately, was the founding father of the of the School of Linguistic Anthropology at the University of Chicago, and was also the teacher of many other anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists in the field. During the next classes that we're going to have together, we're going to try to apply this concept of language ideology to many phenomena in current cultures, to a broad range of signification and communication systems, from mass media to visual artifacts, from everyday life to language attitudes. We're going to do that, of course, with emphasis on the central topic of my present day research, which is once again the face. So in this first introductory class, I should also let you know that there is an important literature that already exists on the concept of a language ideology. So for instance, a very good point of departure is the collective volume Language Ideologies, Practice and Theories that was published in 1998. So in the, I'm going to give you then the bibliography of the course with all the references. So in the introductory essay of this collective volume, introductory essay which is entitled Introduction, Language Ideology as a Field of Inquiry, Catherine Woolard, who was a professor of anthropology at the University of California at San Diego, traces a brief theoretical history of the concept of language ideology, and gives a summary of the most influential definitions of this concept. So let me give you an idea of these definitions. We're gonna read them together because they're a good point of departure. So I hope that you can read with me through the sharing of the screen. Okay. So I hope that this is visible to you. Otherwise, please let me know. These are the most common definitions so far of the notion of language ideology. So the first definition was given by Michael Silverstein in 1979. Sets of beliefs about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use. So Michael Silverstein, first definition of a language ideology, 1979, sets of beliefs about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use. But then there was further research on language ideology, and there were also some slight nuances, modification, changes in the way in which this concept was articulated and defined. So Heath, another linguistic anthropologist, in 1989 defined language ideologies about self-evident ideas. This is the second definition. Self-evident ideas and objectives a group holds concerning roles of language in the social experiences of members as they contribute to the expression of the group. So again, second definition given by Heath in 1989, self-evident ideas and objectives a group holds concerning roles of language in the social experiences of members as they contribute to the expression of the group. You can see that there are already some differences between the two definitions. On the one hand, Silverstein focuses on sets of beliefs about language, but on the contrary, in If, we don't have beliefs anymore, but we have self-evident ideas, but also objectives. So something that concerns not only what a community believes about language, but also what a community wants to do, wants to attain with language. And there are other differences, because Heath underlines the fact that these ideas should be self-evident, but are not necessarily the product of a rationalization or a justification. So you see, when Silverstein is saying that language ideologies are about a rationalization or a justification of perceived language structure and use, basically this scholar is saying that his beliefs must be explicit, must be actually the product of a rationalization. In the second case, on the contrary, self-evident ideas and objectives are not necessarily the product of a rationalization or a justification. These are ideas that are somehow accepted as self-evident by a community. Then there is this third definition in time, which was given by Irvine in 1989, which defines language ideology as a cultural system of ideas about the social and linguistic relationship, together with the loading of moral and political interests. This third definition is actually pretty interesting, because somehow it is the first definition that retrieves the moral and political connotation of the traditional idea of ideology. You remember the concept of ideology that was prominent, especially in philosophy, in political philosophy, in Marx, in Engels, but also in Ferruccio Rossilandi, in the Semiotics of Umberto Eco or Roland Barthes. So Irvine in 1989 underlines the fact that actually these ideas about language form a cultural system. These ideas in this cultural system are mostly about social and linguistic relationship, but they're not neutral. So these ideas form a cultural system, but they also have a loading of moral and political interests. So you can see that there is a quite important difference between the first two definitions and the third one. The first two definitions are pretty neutral from the political point of view. So they are basically linguistic definitions, anthropological definitions. They do not actually emphasize the fact that these definitions might also be the product of political interests, of moral interests, which is something that will be important in our course. So we'll have to consider that these semiotic ideologies, language ideologies, also have some moral and political entailments. The way in which communities think about the role of language in society also has a political background, also has a moral background, at least according to the definition of Irvine. And then, fourth definition, Ramsey, 1990, which defines language ideologies as shared bodies of common sense notions about the nature of language in the world. This is a very, let's say, plain definition. It is quite all-encompassing. It is not specific in its terms. It doesn't refer to any moral or political understanding, and it points to the fact that these notions are part of common sense, that they are a shared body of ideas. So there is an important difference between this definition, the first one, because the first one points out that these ideas are actually the result of a rationalization, of a justification. So it's something that emerges after that people think explicitly, reflect about how language works in a society, what language is in a society. On the contrary, according to Ramsey, 1990, these ideas are basically common sense notions, so they are shared by everyone who belongs to a certain community of speakers. And then there is the definition by Hullard, which is sort of a synthesis of the first four, because the first four definitions, as I've already underlined, differ within each other because they stress more or less the implicit or explicit nature of these ideas, of the ideas that constitute language ideologies. So Woolard puts them all together and comes up with the definition of language ideologies as representations, whether explicit or implicit, that construe the intersection of language and human beings in a social world. So this definition is somehow a compromise, a good compromise, because it takes into account the fact that the way we use language in a society is actually given, influenced both by explicit representation and by implicit representations, but by ideas on language that we implicitly share, and that by ideas on language that we explicitly share. So what is the most common explicit idea on language that Western societies share? As students of linguistics, for instance, if you ask first-year students a very simple but also a very complex question, if you go to first-year students at the University of Turin and you ask them, what is the purpose of language? So what is the main function of language? What is it that they're going to give as an answer? They're going to give as an answer more or less the same statement. They're going to answer that language is about communication, that the main function of language is to communicate. And of course this might be considered a very good answer and even a neutral answer, but it's not. It's actually an answer that is shaped by a very specific language ideology. So it is according to a very specific language ideology that students now believe that language is about communication, because it is not always the case. In many cases, in many periods of human history, it was exactly the contrary. And even nowadays, language is not always about communication. Language is also about conflict, is also about lack of communication, is also about ambiguity. Language can be used in order to divide people, in order to separate people, in order to exclude people, not only in order to include people. So the idea that language is only about communication, or that the main function of language is that of communicating, is an answer that is shaped by the prevailing language ideology of our times, a language ideology that is shaped by globalization, global commerce, translation, and the idea that language is actually something that human beings universally use to communicate. Not always, sometimes language, as we will see, is also used in order not to communicate, in order to introduce ambiguity, in order to block the contact between human beings. It is a definition that understates and underestimates the amount of ambiguity, uncertainty, irrationality that there is in language. So this is just a very short survey, initial survey of what language ideology, what language ideologies are. Now we're going to take a little break after this third part of the class, and we're going to resume at 11 o'clock sharp, so in 10 minutes, and maybe we're going to have some discussion if you have any questions, because we are supposed also to adopt this language ideology and discuss. So let's have 10 minutes break and then resume at 11 sharp. So it's time for us to discuss a little bit if there are any questions or comments about this first part of the class. It was a general introduction, quite a theoretical yet, but it was important that you have an idea of what the direction of the course is. So to summarize, to have a broad definition of semiotics, to problematize the definition and etymology of semiotics, to introduce the concepts of interpretation and ideology, to emphasize the fact that there are two different traditions of study of ideology. On the one hand, the political and philosophical one; on the other hand, the linguistic and anthropological one, and that we can use the concept of language ideology and as we shall see, also the concept of semiotic ideology in order to better understand what are the cultural implications of many artifacts, behaviors, phenomena in our societies. So I don't know whether there are any comments, questions, or perplexities, and so on and so forth. In this case, I'm really, I would be really glad to discuss with you, and if possible, also answer your questions. So, are there any questions or comments that you would like to share? You can also do it in Chinese through the teaching assistant, of course, if you feel like. Okay, are we interpreting the reality by science, or are we actually interpreting the science themselves? Ooh, wow, this is a very difficult question. Thank you very much for asking it. Well, in order to answer this question, we should probably go back to the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce. I don't know if you are familiar with it. Charles Sanders Peirce has been the founding father of one of the major branches of semiotics, mainly the branch that is now called semiotics, the US tradition. And according to Charles Sanders Peirce, a sign can be defined as something that stands for something else, for someone under some respects or capacities. So it's a standard definition of the sign according to Peirce: something that stands for something else to someone under some respects or capacities. And the sign that Peirce had in mind is a triangular model, is a triad. So there is the representamen, there is the object, and then there is the interpretant between the two. So basically what Charles Sanders Peirce, cannot go into details now, but what Charles Sanders Peirce underlined is that reality never actually speaks directly. Reality never speaks autonomously. Reality always speaks through signs. In a way, the epistemological model of Charles Sanders Peirce is basically a Kantian one. Probably you are familiar with Immanuel Kant's philosophy, but one of the most famous concepts is the distinction between the phenomenon and the noumenon. So the phenomenon is ontological reality as it appears, and the noumenon is the ontological reality as it is. And we cannot access the ontological reality as it is in Kant. So the noumenos cannot be accessed. What we can access is how the ontological noumenon becomes a phenomenon. And we can study also the schematas of this, let's say, appearing of reality through phenomena. In Charles Sanders Peirce, there is the same idea. Peirce, from this point of view, is definitely a post-Kantian philosopher. So reality manifests itself through semiosis, through signification. So we cannot actually study reality directly. We must study it through science. For instance, even when we measure something, when we study reality in natural sciences, what we do is to interpret science about reality that we create through specific mechanisms and tools that produce what Peirce would call indexes. So the answer to your very interesting question is that when we interpret reality, we actually interpret science. We don't interpret reality itself. But the good question is, are there any limits to the way in which we interpret the signs through which reality manifests itself? Because you see, there is a very important problem, and it is the fundamental problem that is discussed by Jacques Derrida in Deconstructionism, but also by Umberto Eco in his theory of interpretation, up to the book he wrote about Kantian philosophy, Kant and the Platypus. If reality speaks only through science, and we cannot access reality directly, how can we know that what we say about reality is correct? Because what we say it about the science of reality. And Peirce's idea was that actually, despite the fact that reality only talks through science, and despite the fact that we can only interpret science of reality and not reality itself, reality is a kind of an ontological limit. So if we don't interpret reality correctly, at some stage the signs that we are producing will somehow show that our interpretation is not correct. They're going to showing us at some stage that the way we are interpreting reality through the science is not the most appropriate one. Not all semioticians and not all philosophers agree. For instance, in deconstructionism, there is the idea that since reality cannot be accessed, basically you can play with science and there are no limits to interpretation. There are no limits. It's also the idea that fundamentally was expressed by Nietzsche, according to which every interpretation is a rhetoric. So there is no, there are no facts. There are only interpretations. You know, this is the famous statement by Nietzsche. This is just the beginning of an answer, because it's a very complex philosophical question. But in a nutshell, the idea of semiotics is that although the real is not something that we can grasp, so semiotics is not logics. Semiotics is not about the truth of what is said. Semiotics is about the likeliness of what is said. Despite this, we can still rank interpretations. We can still decide whether an interpretation is better than another one. So we are not into the realm, the domain of the irrational, because you see, Nietzsche's ideas of interpretation, which is also present somehow in deconstructionism, so the idea that anything goes, so any interpretation can be correct because we cannot access reality, because there are no facts, can be dangerous in some domains. You know, can be dangerous in history, for instance. You know, what if historians affirmed that the facts of history do not actually matter? What matters is interpretation. You know, according to semiotics, historians of course interpret facts, and there is no history without interpretation. But at the same time, history is not just interpretation. Things actually happened. Tragedies in history are not just a figment of historians' imagination. There are traces, there are proofs, there is evidence. But it's a very complex epistemological question, and thank you very much for asking this question. A question about the relation between semiotics, ideology, and interpretation. So, semiotics is a discipline, is mostly an academic discipline that studies and compares different methods for interpretation. So we are all interpreting realities. Even if you go in the street here, you're going to come across some kids, some children. They also interpret reality. They interpret reality even when they play with each other. So interpretation is everywhere. But at the same time, there are some domains in which interpretation is not simply a spontaneous activity. It is an activity that follows certain rules. So these children in the street play with each other and interpret each other's movements when they play, interpret each other's words or faces. They do that spontaneously. But at the same time, if we go to the hospital, we wouldn't like our doctor to interpret our bodies spontaneously. If we go to the court, to the courthouse, we wouldn't like the judge or the lawyers to interpret our situation spontaneously. We would like the doctor and we would like the judge to interpret our situation not spontaneously, but according to a certain method, to a method that has been somehow tested, that is accepted intersubjectively by a certain academic and professional community. So we want our doctor to be a professional interpreter. We don't want our doctor to be a spontaneous interpreter. We want our judge to be a professional interpreter. We don't want our judge to be a spontaneous interpreter. You know, just an example that I give all the time. You know, just imagine Professor LEONE go to the doctor and with his blood tests, and the doctor says, Professor LEONE, I'm sorry, but you only have 6 months of life ahead. And then the doctor adds, but this is just my interpretation. You know, we wouldn't like a doctor to say such a thing, you know, to say that the diagnosis is just a matter of subjective interpretation. We would like actually a doctor to say something that is close to objectivity. So interpretation is everywhere, but professional interpretation belongs to certain domains, and these domains are domains that particularly matter in a society. And it's not just medicine or law, even in universities, even among professors, you can find professional interpreters. So everybody can read a novel and interpret it, of course, and everybody does it. So everyone who reads a novel gives spontaneously an interpretation of it. But at the same time, when we go to university and we follow a class of English literature about Shakespeare, we wouldn't like to take lessons from a spontaneous interpreter. We want again to take lessons from a professional interpreter of Shakespeare who has known and read the literature, who has studied Shakespeare in depth, who knows the language, etc., etc. Of course, this is not exactly comparable, because the professional interpreter of Shakespeare, the academic interpreter of Shakespeare, the professor of English literature, is not exactly like the professional interpreter of my blood tests, because the two subjects, the two matters are different. You know, on the one hand, we have an interpreter of signs that emerge from facts, and a person would call them indexes. And on the other hand, you have an interpreter of signs that emerge from other signs, and all these are mostly symbolical signs, as Peirce would call them. So let's say it's much easier to distinguish between a professional interpreter of a blood test and a non-professional interpreter of it, between a doctor and a non-doctor, than distinguishing between a professional interpreter of literature and a non-professional interpreter of literature. So, but nevertheless, to answer your question, yes, everyone is an interpreter, but semiotics is a discipline that tries to develop a systematic knowledge of interpretation, also with the aim of improving the human ability of elaborating interpretations. Now, what is the relation between ideology and semiotics? What is the relation between ideology and interpretation? Semiotics also studies ideologies, meaning that ideologies are mindsets, sets of ideas that influence people in the construction and in the interpretation of science. But at the same time, and this is a little bit difficult, is a little bit paradoxical, but it is important to underline, semioticians are not outside of the world. They are not outside of language. Semioticians interpret professionally language, but they must do so with language and within language. And that has as a consequence the fact that semioticians too might be ideological. Semioticians too interpret according to a certain ideology. So semiotics interprets ideology, but ideology is also somehow underpinning the semiotic interpretation, which makes the exercise of semiotics quite paradoxical and even contradictory sometimes. And as regards the relation between ideology and interpretation, we always interpret according to a certain ideology. This is the case in the political acceptance of the word ideology. So if we are members of the US individualistic, consumistic society, probably we interpret our movies, our novels, our everyday life with this mindset. If we are citizens of the communitarian, collectivistic, communism-inspired Chinese society, we have a different understanding and interpretation of what we read, of what we see, of our everyday life, of our relations with people, and so on and so forth. I gave you the example of the face masks. You know, even the way in which we understand diseases, epidemics, changes in relation to our predominant ideology. At the same time, we can also interpret our ideology. We can make an effort in order to somehow be more lucid, aware about the ideological implications of our effort of interpreting. But that's a very complex question again, so we're going to go back to these issues during the course. This is just to give you a short answer. And so, thanks for your detailed explanation of language ideology. Does this belong to anthropology? People who speak different languages must have different language ideologies, but what is the methodology? How to interpret it? Thanks. Well, thank you very much. A very good question. Indeed, it belongs to anthropology. Even historically, it stems from anthropology. The idea that people who speak different languages have different language ideologies, but I would say even more, because you see, anthropology traditionally focuses on, let's say, pre-industrial, pre-technological societies, which are very compact. They are culturally very homogeneous. But as you move from these traditional communities, let's say the linguistic community of the Samoa Islands, and you try to apply the concept of language ideology to more complex, more technologically complex societies, which are much more multifarious, with much more internal variety, then you have another problem, that even within the same linguistic community there are different language ideologies. And I would probably suggest that these language ideologies within the same linguistic community have a lot to do with the idea of class. So according to the socio-economic class, there is, in many cases, a different understanding of how language works. In some socioeconomic classes, language is something academic, cultivated in school, through poetry, through literature. In some other socioeconomic classes, language is a tool. It's a tool to obtain things from others. It's a tool to have an impact on others. So even within the same linguistic community, there might be different language ideologies. How to study them? Well, we'll go back to this question, to the question of methodology, which is very important. But again, it depends on the definition that you give. You know, you remember the 5 definitions that I've given, the ones that were formulated throughout history. And some, the first 2, would underline, emphasize the explicit character of language ideologies. So if language ideologies are conceived as explicit, then the methodology is relatively easier, because what you do is basically a survey. You go to people, to a group of people who are selected as representative of a community with the classical methods of a sociological inquiry, and you ask them, what is language for you? What is the role of language in a society? What is the difference between what is the difference between men and women in relation to language? What is the difference between adults and children? Do you think that your language is more developed than other languages? Do you think that your language is better than other languages? Is language different in specific domains, the political domains, the religious domains, etc., etc.? How is it polite in society to speak? Is it good in society to speak a lot, to speak little? It is good that elderly people speak first. Who must speak first? Who must follow? In a community, in a group of people, in a group of friends, who has the final word? How do you handle conflict? How do you handle disagreement? And so on and so forth. These are all questions that you can explicitly ask to individuals who are members of a community in order to know what they think about language. But this is about explicit ideas. What about the implicit ideas? The implicit ideas are much more difficult to understand because people adhere to a certain ideology of language. People adopt a certain language ideology even if they don't know that they are adopting it. So people, for instance, feel that they must show a special reverence, a special respect when they speak with elderly people. But it's not that they have been taught to do so. It's not that this is written somewhere. They have absorbed this as a habit of their culture and as part, implicit content of its language ideology. So in this case, you cannot simply ask people what they think about language. You must observe them, you must collect their language productions, their utterances, and decode them according to a method which of course might be the semiotic method, but sociolinguistics also adopts a similar method in order to understand what are the social connotations of language in a certain community. So the answer is yes. Different languages usually have different language ideologies, but different language ideologies might coexist even within the same linguistic community. And as regards methodology, it is direct sociological survey in the case of explicit ideas about language, and in the case of implicit ideas about language, the methodology is much more indirect, risky, prone to failure. It must be semiotic. It must be interpret what people say in order to understand what their ideology is. Now I'll give you an example. Well, in Chinese you don't have that, but in many European languages you have different ways, different pronouns that you use when you address people. Now, in English it's just you, but in French is tu when you know someone, and is vous when you don't know someone. It's much more complicated, but it's the same in Spanish. You have tu when you know someone, you have usted when you don't know someone. In Italian is tu when you know someone, and it is voi or lei when you don't know someone. In German is du when you know someone, and is sie when you don't know someone. So there is in language a distinction in terms of pronouns and verbal morphology, depending on whether you are talking to someone whom you know or to someone whom you don't know, or someone you should show respect to. So by simply analyzing what pronouns people use, you have an idea of how language is used in certain contexts. For instance, if you realize that, as it is the case, if you go to the postal office in Turin here, and there is the clerk in the postal office, and I go to the clerk and ask something, and the clerk will use the lei, so the, let's say, respectful pronoun, in order to talk to me. But then someone who looks like a non-Italian person, an African person for instance, enters the same postal office, the clerk might use the pronoun tu. And of course she or he does it spontaneously, but by using that pronoun she's also somehow showing that language is used in the Italian community also to distinguish between who is a member of the community, legitimate member, and so it must be shown respect, and who, on the contrary, is talked to a little bit like a child. You know, like in many communities, if you are a foreigner, you are talked to as if you were a child. You know, so that's another example. But we're going to go back to this question. So thank you very much for your comment. And another question about language ideology: is it more genetic or biological? Is it something that's been input in human beings' brain? What is behind language ideology, or the idea of language ideology? Thanks again. Okay, thank you. Now this is a very complex question, and the answer must be complex as well. So the let's say general framework of linguistic anthropology, as it has been developed by the Chicago School of Linguistic Anthropology, for instance, is a culturalist one. So differences are not explained in terms of natural processes, they are explained in terms of cultural processes. So we do not speak different languages because we are biologically different. We speak different languages because we culturally differ from each other, because history is actually created through myriads of micro-interactions, different linguistic communities. The same goes for language ideologies. But this, let's say, purely cultural and culturalistic approach, so the idea that language ideologies are different in purely cultural terms, is more and more, let's say, investigated and even questioned by people who, on the contrary, would like to naturalize these differences. So would like to show, for instance, that, well, maybe language ideologies are also something that relates not only with the human culture but also with the human brain. So there are lots of very controversial investigations about, you know, whether there is a difference between let's say the female or the male approach to language. You know, the usual feministic female status approach to this question is that no, there is no biological difference between the way in which men and women talk in a society. It's all a cultural product, it's all a cultural result. But at the same time, there are other scholars who say, well, but at the same time, you know, the bodies of male speakers and female speakers are different, so this has an impact also on the way in which they talk and on the ideas of the relation with language. So the answer is language ideologies are traditionally considered by linguistic anthropology as a pure product of culture, but more and more research is being carried on about the brain and the possible natural causes of these differences. Let's say that probably the right answer is in the middle. So it is in deconstructing this difference between nature and culture, between the brain and the mind. Our mind is also our brain, and our brain is our mind. Our nature is our culture, but our culture is also our nature. You know, it's very difficult for us to understand these dialectics in terms of continuity and not in terms of opposition. But that is probably the future ahead, and also the task ahead, to understand, study the continuity between brain and mind, between nature and culture. And then what is the relationship between metaphors and science? Can we understand this relationship through Roland Barthes' conception of myth? Well, metaphors are one of the most studied objects of many disciplines, from rhetoric to linguistics to philosophy to even cognitive sciences. So I'm not going to give a survey, a 2-minute survey of the state of the art on metaphors. To give a very short answer, for semiotics, signs proliferate. They're like mushrooms. They basically spring from the ground everywhere. It's impossible to stop this mushrooming of signs. At the same time, if you want to eat mushrooms, if you want to, it's almost lunchtime here in Italy, so I'm going to talk a little bit about food, but I'm sorry. But if you want to make a risotto with mushrooms, you cannot just go to the wood and pick up whatever mushrooms you want, because probably you're gonna hurt yourself very badly. You're gonna die. So mushrooms are everywhere, but if you want to cook a risotto with mushrooms, if you want to cook pasta with mushrooms or rice with mushrooms, you must know which mushrooms you are supposed to pick up in the wood. So it means that you must categorize the mushrooms. You must be able to distinguish between good mushrooms and bad mushrooms, mushrooms that can be eaten and mushrooms that cannot be eaten. You must be able to recognize them, and one of the easiest way to recognize them is, of course, to associate their shape with the name. You know, these are Manicula muscarius, you know, these mushrooms are poisonous, I'm not going to make a risotto with them, the other ones are good. So, according to semiotics, although mushrooms are everywhere, in order to interact properly and effectively with the environment, we must categorize the environment through language. And this categorization somehow crystallizes language. So what happens when a new metaphor is created? A new metaphor is like coming across a new mushroom in the wood. A mushroom that has not been categorized yet, that looks like other mushrooms, but is not a mushroom that you can easily say, okay, this is a good one, this is a bad one. It is a surprising mushroom. A metaphor is a surprising mushroom in the wood. So it can be a wonderful thing because you can pick it up and realize that it has a fantastic taste, but it can also be a failure. It can be poisonous, meaning that if you're a poet and you come up with a metaphor, you can disclose new horizons of meaning through that metaphor, and this is the good mushroom. But you could also be misunderstood, or you might end up not being understood at all. This is the bad mushroom. But semiotics says something else as well. It says that in order to have that new mushroom somehow appearing in the wood, you must also be able to compare them with already existing and already known mushrooms. So in order to have a metaphorical use of language, we must have a literal use of language as well, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to recognize the novelty of a metaphor. So when Roland Barthes talks about myths, he talks about them in quite a different way, meaning that for Barthes, which is in keeping with the understanding of myths of Levi-Strauss, after all, myths are metaphors an entire society lives by. They are metaphors that are collectively accepted and shared in order to circulate a meaning that cannot circulate through literal expression, through literal meaning. So yeah, in a way there is a relation between myths and metaphors, but it's one again that is very complex, and for the time being I think our time is over. It has been a great pleasure being with you. There were some minor technical problems, I apologize for them, but I thank you for your patience. It was a long morning for me, a long evening for you, and thank you for your questions, and thank you also to Dr. Nisi Chang for organizing this encounter in such a smooth way.